A crime so strange it leaves even Holmes baffled. Welcome to Silent Case Files. I am your host, Pendleton. Where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment. Your thoughts make every mystery unforgettable. Let's uncover the truth. On a January night, when the Thames breathed out its chill like a living thing, a police launch cut across the sluggish current between Westminster and Lambeth, its whistle plaintive and thin in the fog. Lanterns bobbed along the embankment. Watchmen called to one another in blunt, hollow tones, and beneath Vauxhall Bridge a knot of onlookers, rivermen, and night porters for the most part, gathered to stare at a sleek, low craft moored in the gloom. The name picked out in silver leaf upon her prow, Midnight Swan, shone dully whenever a lamp swung by and threw off a hesitant fan of light. The launch had been discovered not a quarter of an hour earlier by a waterman of long experience, who, taking advantage of slack tide, had pushed off from the Millbank stairs. He thought at first he had chanced upon some gentleman's private excursion returned late to its berth. But as he hailed the watch with the cheerful insolence of the river, the only answer was the creak and chafe of rope and a faint, irregular tapping from within the Swan's carved cabin, as though the wind played upon loose glass. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard arrived 5 minutes later with a sergeant and 2 constables, their boots clanging the iron steps down to the water. The wind thrust the fog aside in tatters, so that the lanterns showed the launch to be of excellent make, lacquered wood, little brass fittings, and careful varnish work that spoke of a gentleman's taste and purse. The Swan on her prow was a thing of whimsy, wings curving toward the water, the long neck made to shine like a crescent, when the moon, if ever it penetrated London's winter veil, might strike it. "Break it," said Lestrade, curt and tired, when the sergeant reported the cabin door secured from within, and no reply to their hammering. A crowbar was fetched from the police boat. The lock gave way after 2 blows, and the cabin's stale, expensive warmth, whisky, beeswax, and some faint, acrid trace, rolled out into the night. Upon the divan at the rear bulkhead, fully dressed in evening clothes, and with a plaid thrown haphazardly over his knees, sat a gentleman of 45 or 50 years, his head canted at a ghastly angle against a velvet cushion. The lantern light glimmered upon a pale, clever face, blued around the lips, and the stiff gleam of a diamond at the tie. The right hand lay along the cushion, the fingers lightly curled, while the left, as though in the act of some trivial adjustment, half clutched at the cord of the bell-pull that dangled from a brass ring in the ceiling. On the inlaid table beside him, a glass stood with 2 remaining fingers of whisky, and beside it a little porcelain dish on which reposed a single black feather. "The devil," said Lestrade quietly, and reached to feel for a pulse at the man's neck. He withdrew his fingers at once and drew the plaid over the face. "Gas ring there, sir," offered the sergeant, squinting. "But the jet's off, and no smell of it." "No," Lestrade murmured. "Not gas." He stooped to the bell cord, then frowned and held up his gloved thumb. "Ink, printer's ink or some abominable substitute. Why in heaven's name would anyone smear the bell cord?" He looked about the cabin with a practised eye. On the floor was a narrow smear of mud drying into a pale crust, not the black reek of ordinary foreshore, but a clay of a lighter tint, an oddly fine grain. On a shelf above the divan a small cabinet clock ticked sedately at a few minutes past 12. The windows, if one could call them such, were oval bull's-eyes of thick glass, shut and spun with frost. On the forward bulkhead hung a pair of marine paintings, river scenes, in competent hand, one of them depicting swans under a winter sky. "Inspector," the sergeant said again, softer, "it's Lord Alistair Vale." The name fell like a stone into the close room. Lestrade drew the plaid back again and examined the face with greater care. Yes, he knew the late nobleman by sight. A man known in town for delicate finance and a certain showy philanthropy, hospitals, music halls, river-works, together with a cool, self-possessed manner in conversation that was either admirable or insufferable according to one's taste. That he should be discovered thus, in so private a lair, and with no servant in attendance, struck Lestrade as emblematic of the Thames itself, smooth on the surface, foully busy beneath. "Fetch Dr. Bartlett from the yard," said he, "and send a man to messengers. There is a lady who must be told. Keep the people back from the embankment. Let the launch stand as she is." He took up the black feather from the dish and turned it over in the light. It was lustrous and long, its vein narrow and tapered, and it struck him suddenly as wrong that it should be black at all, for what swan is black upon the Thames? He looked again at the painting on the bulkhead. White swans against a grey river, nature correct and comfortable. He returned the feather to its dish and felt again the cold wind probing at the gap of the broken door. The irregular tapping that had first been heard had resolved itself. A lanyard, somewhere forward, beat fitfully against a brass plate with every subtle shift of the current, as if a nervous finger tapped a question that no one could answer. By noon of the following day, the dailies had their headline, "Mysterious Death of a Peer on the Thames, Valerian Feather and Locked Cabin." Rumour, mischievous sprite that she is, ran ahead of fact, as usual. It was said by some that a secret society had claimed him, by others that rivermen had seen a ghostly bird circling low upon the water, and by more sober tongues that the noble Lord's far-reaching speculations had at last exacted the price paid by unquiet consciences. Dr. John Watson, who had heard all this before his second cup of coffee, judged the whole braying chorus with the tolerant disapproval of a medical man and a soldier, both professions which teach one to distrust hysteria. He also judged, though he would not have said so aloud, that the case, as baldly presented in the press, would soon find its way to Baker Street. There was something in the words locked cabin that would stir the curiosity of his old friend as surely as a faint footprint upon a Persian carpet. And when the bell rang and the landlady's step came firm along the passage, he had already laid aside the newspaper with a smile. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a woman of about 30, veiled and pale, the sort of pallor that owes as much to will as to shock. Her dress was expensive enough to make it noticeable without being ostentatious. Her gloved hands showed none of the tremors one might expect in calamity. She raised the veil with one precise motion and looked about the room with an appraising calm that Watson, who admired composure in any form, recognized at once as trained. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, "and Dr. Watson. I had hoped to find you both." Holmes had been seated cross-legged upon the rug, tuning a violin string with the exactness of a watchmaker. He now rose, laid the instrument upon the mantel, and bowed with a gravity which he reserved for grief and music. "You do us honour, madam. Pray be seated. You will forgive me if I observe that you have come to us by way of the Foreign Office, no doubt by the short entrance from Downing Street, though your carriage is hired and not your own. You were delayed 10 minutes by a messenger who failed to find you where he expected, and you have eaten nothing since yesterday evening. Lestrade has told you as much as he knows, which is little." Even through her composure, a fluctuation showed like the quick lift of a curtain in a draught. "Sir," she said, with the faintest suggestion of impatience, "you are entirely correct, and time is of the essence. I am Lady Theodosia Vale. My husband was Lord Alistair. I am told that his death occurred under—" She paused, as if the words were distasteful. under circumstances which, if misunderstood, will ruin not only our name, but the lives of several people who are innocent." Holmes's eyes narrowed the least degree. "Innocent of what? Murder, scandal, or the river?" "Of a folly," she answered crisply, "and of an oath whose breaking would be worse than death, at least to them. Mr. Holmes, I require your assistance. I am not a woman inclined to melodrama, but I swear to you that the presence of that feather in my husband's cabin is either a monstrous contrivance or a signal of danger that did not end last night." Watson had the sense then of being admitted not into a domestic sorrow, but a carefully demarcated circle of anxiety in which every word was measured. Holmes extended his long fingers toward the fire, but did not warm them, as if the action were more habit of thought than need. "The feather," he said, and his tone made a question of the single noun. "Black," Lady Theodosia said. "A feather from a swan that is no swan at all. My husband named his launch for a club, an association, whose emblem is such a bird. If that feather was placed there by one of them, it is a warning. If by another, it is a vile slander. In either case, it is an error, for my husband would never have—" She checked herself with admirable discipline. "You see, Mr. Holmes, how quickly even the truth can sound like prevarication. I beg you to examine the launch and to speak with Inspector Lestrade. He has orders to admit you. I will tell you what I may. I cannot tell you all." Holmes glanced at Watson. In that one fleeting look, Watson read eagerness, irritation, and amusement, eagerness at the intellectual scent, irritation at the hint of withheld facts, and amusement that fate, which had denied him a case for a week, now offered one that came with a feathered riddle and a locked door. "Very well," said Holmes. "We shall go to the river at once. Dr. Watson, your coat, if you please. Lady Theodosia, what you cannot tell me now you will later. For the present, give us such particulars as may be safely ventilated in an open boat." She hesitated, then, with that same economical decision, removed from her reticule a small velvet case. Within lay a gilt pin, a swan with outstretched wings, worked with uncommon delicacy. One of the eyes, which should have been tiny beads of jet, was missing. "This was my husband's," she said. "He wore it when he went out after dinner. He did not return with it." Holmes did not touch the pin. He stooped instead and brought his face to within a hand's breadth of it, as if the air above could supply what surface and metal withheld. "Curious," he murmured. "The missing eye? Yes. And a trace of— No, I shall reserve that observation until I have seen Lestrade's ink-stained bell-pull." He straightened, his voice brisk. "Come, Watson. The river never answers to the impatient, but she yields to those who listen. Lady Theodosia, have your carriage take us to Millbank. We shall trouble you again before the day is out." As they descended, Watson heard the rattle of the winter wind at the window, and thought, with a quickening he could not suppress, that the Thames, like the melody of a violin when Holmes set bow to string, could be as subtle and treacherous as any human thing. He had not liked the black feather. He liked still less the discipline of Lady Theodosia's voice, which told him that the truth of the matter would not be coaxed, but prized, from layers of pride and secrecy as obstinate as ice. In the street a driver flicked frost from his hat. London's fog lay in low, slow banks, as if the city were a battlefield cooling after the day's carnage. Holmes sprang into the carriage with that peculiar elastic grace of his. "A locked door on water," he said, as the wheels clattered off in the direction of the river. "A feather out of place. Ink where there should be none, and a lady who names oaths in the same breath as death. Admirable, Watson. We shall have work for your eyes and mine." Watson, whose heart had already leapt from the moment Mrs. Hudson spoke the name, felt that satisfying sensation, both chill and warm at once, that the best of their adventures always brought. He glanced at his friend and saw the familiar profile keen against the glass, already far from Baker Street, already in that mind of his, upon the water where a swan that ought to be white had turned midnight black. The carriage, urged to a lively trot, set us down upon the embankment where the Thames, iron-grey and sluggish, shouldered the stone with a sound like weary breathing. A constable, muffled to the ears, saluted as Lady Theodosia's hired coach drew up. Holmes dismissed her with a courteous inclination and a promise. She answered only with a brief, searching look that might have weighed an army before it marched, then let her veil fall and was borne away into the fog. Lestrade was waiting for us by the Millbank steps. He had the impatient air of a man who suspects there is something to be found, and resents that it is not he who has found it. "I suppose you would wish it left as it was," said he. "We have kept a man aboard to discourage curiosity." "As you would discourage a terrier from a rat-hole," Holmes returned pleasantly. "You have my thanks. A locked room afloat always brings with it a current of opinion, strong enough to overturn a lighter, Inspector. Let us see whether it is water or wind that moves this one." We crossed by a narrow gang-plank to the Midnight Swan. The craft rode the water like a cat upon a sill, balanced, self-possessed, and faintly disdainful of the cold. The cabin door, its lock newly split, swung a little on its hinges, and that nervous tapping, lanyard to brass, kept its thin tattoo forward. The policeman on watch made way. Lestrade, with a brusque gesture of invitation, allowed Holmes to pass before him. The gentleman upon the divan had been decently removed. A folded rug marked the place where the late Lord Vale's head had rested. Otherwise, nothing had been disturbed. The air retained its close savour, spirits, polish, and that faint, acrid remnant which my nose identified as the ghost of a volatile compound rather than any household gas. Holmes stood without speaking for near a minute, not as a man confronted by a puzzle, but as a listener intent upon a piece of imperfectly tuned music. "The bell cord, if you please," he said at last. Lestrade indicated it. Holmes produced his lens, and with the easy stoop of a man who has made a compact with his own spine, brought the frayed tassel and the cord to within an inch of his eye. He touched one finger to the stained portion and lifted it to his nostrils with a delicacy that would have done credit to a perfumer. "Not printer's ink," he observed. "Your thumb was respectful, Inspector, but your nose was betrayed by its associations. This is a non-oily black, lamp-black in gum, perhaps, applied in a single quick smear. The tassel shows the drag of a right-handed motion from aft to forward, and it is placed not at the natural reach of a seated man, but 4 inches higher." Lestrade shrugged. "Mere drama, then?" "Always beware of ornament in crime," Holmes answered. "Men adorn what they fear will not be believed without it. The drama, if such it be, was enacted with an audience in mind, an audience that would include you. Watson, your thoughts upon the air?" "It is not gas," I said. "There is a reminiscence of ether or of a light anaesthetic, now departed. The glass on the table shows no ring of recent filling. The whisky has stood long enough to shed its more volatile notes." Holmes inclined his head. "Just so. The draught from the broken door would have scoured a weaker spirit away by now. Yet beeswax and Polish persist. Note also the frost on the bull's eyes, heavy still, despite the lanterns of last night. Inspector, at what hour was the cabin first opened?" "A little after midnight," said Lestrade. "Dr. Bartlett placed the time of death between 10:30 and midnight. The clock there," he indicated the neat little French piece upon the shelf, "was at 12 when we found it." Holmes took up the clock with a gloved hand, turned it to observe the backplate, and set it down again without comment. He had already knelt by the strip of pale clay I had noticed the night before. With a penknife, he lifted a flake of the crust into an envelope and with the same instrument teased at the edges of the smear where it narrowed and seemed to end in a faint stippling. "Not boot, not heel," he murmured. "Nor is it the slovenly track of a careless foot. This is the kiss of a narrow edge. Leather, yes, but not under a man's weight. The droplet there, fell from above, then was trailed. What says the forward deck?" We followed him out into the cold. Holmes moved along the starboard rail, with his head a little on one side, like a bird ready to peck. The tapping lanyard came to a brass ventilator whose cap bore a faint smear upon its rim. The smear, when Holmes scraped it with the penknife, yielded a whisper of the same pale clay. He pointed with the blade to a tiny abrasion on the rail itself, fresh, bright metal exposed beneath varnish. "A burden set down in haste, and not in the dark," he said. "A careful man would have slipped a rag under it to spare the finish. There is no rag. We will not find one thrown overboard. Men who love neatness do not fling their rags into the world as witness to their untidiness. Inspector, who are Lord Vale's boatmen?" "He had none in his private launches. He liked to drive his own toys, so I am told. The public boatmen know the vessel by sight. We've a list of his servants on land." "Bring me the list later. For the present, let us examine the interior fittings." Back within, Holmes bent over the little table. The glass stood where it had stood. The porcelain dish, with its single black feather, shone like a solitary pupil in a blind eye. He did not touch the feather. Instead, he inspected the dish's underside, then the table's lip, then the narrow groove where the table met the cabin floor. He used his knife again and freed a thread as fair as silk. When he set it across his glove, it scarcely showed against the leather, save by the way it caught the light. "Watson?" "Silk or its mimic, possibly from a lady's cuff or a decorative pillow." Holmes allowed himself the shade of a smile. "A very charitable doctor. It is from a mask ribbon, I think. The edge is cheap. The fray is telling. Our Lord Vale, if he entertained theatricals, did not spend lavishly on haberdashery for them." "Mask ribbon!" Lestrade exclaimed. "Then he had company." "If the ribbon belonged to a guest," Holmes said, "which is not yet proved. There are masquerades in which one dresses the room and not oneself. Still, the suggestion is interesting." He moved to the spot where Lord Vale had sat. The plaid had shed a few hairs. Holmes lifted one with a moistened finger. "Coarse, from the rug itself? Nothing there. But see the bell cord, stained in one place only, and not at its handiest drop. A smear to ensure that anyone who touched it afterwards would carry off a token of his folly, or her innocence. It is the behaviour of a mind that thinks more of appearances than of economy. A mind that paints signs where signs might otherwise be overlooked." "You were saying," I ventured, "that the murderer wished us to think the bell had been pulled in extremity?" "Precisely." "And yet no servant came." "Why?" "Because there was none to hear. The door was locked from within with a key now missing. Yes, Inspector, I read your report. And our man sat composedly, with his plaid upon his knees. He had leisure to arrange himself, or someone arranged him, who understood the habits of men at their ease." Lestrade rubbed his chin. "Dr. Bartlett says no marks of violence, a faint lividity about the lips." "Which would be consistent with a suffocative agent or a delicate poisoning," I said. "But the glass shows no sediment, and the whisky untouched." Holmes's glance swept once more about the cabin. "No tobacco ash," he remarked. "Lord Vale was a cigar man, if I read the burn upon the forward bulkhead aright. an old scorch, yet no odour of recent smoke. He came to the river to sit in warmth without lighting his vice. Not like him, if the club gossip be true. The man expected an appointment, not leisure. And the feather? Lestrade demanded. Holmes stepped to the painting of swans. White birds where the emblem is black. The club to which Lady Theodosia alluded, she spoke as one accustomed to exact terms, chooses for its sign a creature of rarity. There are black swans in the colonies, but on the Thames they do not glide in nature. A black feather is thus a message, not a shed thing. Yet this feather, look. He took up the dish, at last, not the plume. Holding the dish at an angle, he showed us a fine ring upon its glaze. It has lain before upon a different table. The particles of beeswax are ground into it in a fashion peculiar to an older polish. This table's beeswax smears evenly. The ring bears tiny angular voids, scratches. It was brought from a room less carefully tended than this, with other objects. A portable tableau, one might say. Brought as part of a staging, I murmured. Exactly. And now the clock. He returned to the shelf and touched once the brass rim. Inspector, have you wound it? No. Nor set it? No. It gains 3 minutes in the hour. Holmes's finger flicked the pendulum. If it read a few minutes past 12 when you arrived not long after midnight, then it read so because someone set it to that. The housemaid's trick, Watson, to make the gentleman believe the time kinder than it is. Here, the reverse. A little theatre of midnight, composed so that midnight and Swan should meet in every printed headline to come. Lestrade's brows shot up. You mean he died earlier? Holmes's eyes were alight, though the rest of his face remained as austere as the winter sky. He died before 11, I should say. The frost upon the bull's eyes would not have reformed so thoroughly if the cabin had been opened later than that, given the lanterns and the broken door. The volatile trace that Watson noted has retreated too completely for a death at midnight, but I shall not write it yet. I shall ask, instead, who would wish to persuade us of midnight, who profits by the attention of an emblem, and who knows this launch well enough to pass from rail to deck without leaving the honest, simple mark of a boot. Someone light, then, I said, thinking of the narrow, dragged smear. Someone who set down a case or a small trunk? Or a swan? Holmes breathed. He straightened. Inspector, Lord Vale's valet, does he attend the household still? He is at the house, Lestrade said. Name of Bostock. We are to take his account this afternoon. Let us employ the morning more profitably. There is a club where swans are not white. I will wager my violin string that they hold their meetings in a room with old polish and a taste for ceremony. Come, Watson. If we are to hear the truth, we must first hear the lies men tell themselves for courage. Inspector, keep your watchman, and do not permit your men to pull that cord, stained or no. It has already told us all it can. We left the launch as the fog lifted a hand's breadth from the water, and then settled again, as if thinking better of it. Holmes's stride took on that peculiar lengthening which I had come to recognize as a sign that his mind had leapt an interval the rest of us must cross with ordinary feet. Theodosia Vale, he said softly as we mounted to the street. Oaths and emblems, masks and midnight. A pity that pride is so often the valet of fear, Watson. It opens doors and says nothing of who waits on the other side. And the other side? I asked. For the moment, he returned, hailing a cab with a whistle that cut the mist like a knife. The Strand. There is a print seller near the Adelphi who will tell us who orders swans by the dozen, and whether their eyes are set in jet or glass, From there, we shall see whether London prefers its birds black by fashion or by conspiracy. Our cab rattled eastward with the brisk economy of a driver who scented both fair and frost. Holmes, who had sunk into that inward angle of himself which makes him seem at once present and remote, roused only once to flick a speck of soot from his cuff and murmur, "If men cannot resist the urge to print their vanities, Watson, they will at least help a printer feed his own." We alighted within a few doors of the Adelphi and entered a narrow shop whose windows were half choked with mezzotints of famous actors, ballad sheets, and invitation cards dangling from threads like winter fruit. The proprietor, a sandy, civil person, with an inked thumbnail and the cautious cheer of a tradesman, bowed us into the warm, papery air. Holmes let his gaze rove over the displays with apparent idleness until it paused upon a card bearing, in skilful emboss, a bird with outstretched wings, its head lowered like a dancer in a bow. The bird had been impressed in such a way as to take ink only upon the raised plane of the body, leaving the wing feathers sharp and without blur. The ink chosen for it was a deep, dead black. "A handsome stamp," said Holmes. "I have seen its like, in memory, if not to the eye, within the last 12 hours. The man brightened. "We pride ourselves, sir. The die for that was cut by Lellamy out of Kidderminster. Only 3 orders in 2 years. Private assemblies, if I may say so. The bird? Some club's whimsy." "Dear me," Holmes answered. "Only 3? That shows taste either too fastidious to pay or too rich to need advertisement. You have the books, of course?" The proprietor's cheer faded to diplomacy. "We keep our accounts, sir, but our clients' value. Is there a difficulty? We have supplied nothing treasonable, I am certain." Holmes's card glided across the counter with an ease that had quietened greater men than this. "There is a death upon the river, Mr. Wayshage." "Greaves," said he faintly, reading the name. "Mr. Holmes, Lord Eyre."
"Save us! Your salvation lies merely in recollection," Holmes returned. "The order's using that die." Greaves, torn between prudence and pride, compromised by turning the ledger so that Holmes might see without quite appearing to show it. I stood at his shoulder and read the tidy entries. The first, a winter past, a dozen invitations, the midnight Swan, delivered to Armitage Rooms, Adelphi. The second, midsummer, menus and cards for a private supper, initialed A.V. and sent to Vale House. The third, 3 weeks ago, 24 invitations, same emblem, delivered to Armitage Rooms once more. Holmes touched the winter address with his forefinger. "These rooms still let?" "They are," Greaves said. "Taken by the night by gentlemen who prefer to entertain without dragging their households out at odd hours. Good candles and a sideboard. They pay for discretion, and the landlord makes certain he earns it." "And the ink?" Greaves looked mystified. Holmes indicated the black bird. "This dead black, do you mix it?" "We grind a special cake, sir, for certain stamps. It sits tight upon the paper and does not shine like ordinary writing fluid," Greaves said, warming to his craft. "A lamp-lacking gum rather than oil to avoid spread." Holmes's eyes kindled. "Exactly so. You will oblige me with a cake and a small bottle from that same batch." Greaves produced them with alacrity, and Holmes paid without bargaining, an extravagance that told me the purchase was itself a test. "A last point, Mr. Greaves," he added. "Did the gentleman who ordered the most recent invitations bring his own wording? Was he alone?" Greaves coughed. The wording was simple. "On the river. Midnight." The gentleman did not give a name. He wore gloves and did not remove them to sign. There was, if you will forgive a tradesman's noticing such things, a small notch in the left glove at the second joint of the forefinger. It showed a pale scar beneath. Holmes's gaze lifted another fraction. "You have my thanks." You have seen nothing, of course, and we never asked. Out in the Strand once more, he set a brisker pace, turning off into Maiden Lane where the theatres breathe even by daylight. He halted before a costumer's whose window was an uproar of dominoes, masks, and feathers. Men who send out 24 invitations seldom intend to dine alone, he said. Let us inquire who has been buying their birds. Within, a sharp-featured woman with a yard of measure about her neck looked us over, as she might have measured us for cloaks without our consent. Holmes, in his most degage manner, asked for black feathers suitable for a swan's crest, and, when she brought down a box, declined them at once. "Goose, dyed?" he said. "I require a trifle narrower and more lustrous, a milliner's grade, and masks 12, cheap ribbon, for a room not too well lit." She raised a brow, not refusing his.
"Knowledge. You are not the first, sir, to want blackbirds for the river. Last fortnight we supplied a gentleman with a dozen dominoes and a box of feathers, goose, for he would have nothing dear, and a coil of ribbon, such as you mention. He paid 2 promptly, which is always a mark of either guilt or anticipation. We chose not to mind which." "A dozen," Holmes repeated. "Did his lady attend him?" "There were ladies later. We sell by the hour, as well as the piece. A tall woman with a veil bought a second coil of ribbon and some face powder, of the cheap French kind. She spoke little. Her glove was of kid, fine, but there was a pinhole high on the left, just here. She tapped her own glove on the index finger, where the bone joins the hand. She handled pins under pressure, I would say." Holmes smiled without mirth. "You have an admirable eye. One last trifle. Do you supply small porcelain dishes for sweetmeats, or feathers?" "We do not," she said, affronted. "We dress people, not tables. But our neighbour 3 doors along, Mr. Pottle, second-hand china, can make a festival out of 30 shillings. We thanked her and presently stood in Pottle's dim cavern where porcelain crowded porcelain into a gossip of glazes. A boy emerged from behind a tower of saucers and, being encouraged by Holmes's coin, admitted that a set of 6 small dishes, plain white with a narrow raised rim, had been sold 3 weeks ago to a gentleman who sent a porter for them with a note bearing a bird. Could you read? No, sir, but I can draw. He produced, with the naive pride of his kind, a charcoal squiggle that, to my surprise, caught the obsequious curve of the embossed bird with some felicity. Like that. Holmes patted the boy's shoulder as if to reward the accuracy. "You will do, my lad. If you should be asked, say only that you have a head for pretty shapes." When we had regained the air once more, he drew me into the shelter of a theatre portico and spoke rapidly. "A club that meets at rooms called Armitage, a set of invitations meant to conjure the river into a room, a cheaper grade of mask and feather, and a lady with a pin wound upon the hand that handles what? A brooch, a veil, or a body arranged to look at ease. I do not say it was Lady Theodosia. Her glove would be better than kid, and she would send her maid for ribbon. But I do say that the oath she named last night binds other women as well as men. And Greaves's notch on the glove, remember it. You suppose the same hand that smeared the bell cord ordered the ink. I suppose that the mind which loves an emblem will spread its gospel in any medium." He hailed a cab again. "The Armitage Rooms, if you please, driver. And take the lane by Bedford Street. It saves us the stares of gentlemen who know my hat too well." The Armitage proved to be a house of brick, set back from the street by a wedge of yard, with a discreet bell, and a porter who had learned to be both blind and deaf at his employer's convenience. Holmes's card admitted us to a parlour, where a respectable fire struggled with the damp. The landlord, a wiry man with a sailor's gait, begged us to believe that his rooms were fit for bishops.
For what they are fit I shall judge, Holmes said mildly. Room B, if you please. Room B had an old-fashioned polish upon the table whose angular voids might have kissed the base of a porcelain dish for years. The candles were new. The sideboard shone. But here and there the sustaining fictions of discretion broke down. A faint crescent scratch marred the rail of the window where some object had been set down. Upon the floor by the hearth, a speckle of the same pale clay we had seen on the launch had been ground into the rug like a moth that had died mid-flight. Holmes did not exclaim, for which I was grateful. He passed his lens over the scratches, lifted a crumb of the pale matter into an envelope, and presently, with the gravity of a man asking for salt at table, inquired whether the landlord kept a broom for the yard. "I do," said the man, nettled. "And a boy to use it?" "Aye, Jem." "Fetch Jem." Jem, grey-eyed, straight as a rod, came and eyed us with open suspicion until Holmes contrived to interest him. "You sweep the steps in the little court there. When gentlemen come at night by the side door, do they bring parcels?" "Sometimes." "Boxes?" "Sometimes." "And do they carry them out again?" "Not always." Holmes nodded as if Jem had repeated an axiom. "Has anyone carried a long, narrow case, smooth as if it had been made to lie across a knee? Say twice the length of your forearm and heavy enough to mark the rail when put down?" Jem's eyes grew wary, and then, in spite of himself, bright. He told me not to tell. "He was right," Holmes said gravely. "Do not tell again, only nod." Jem nodded. "Very good. Watson," he added softly, when we had taken our leave amid the landlord's flustered politeness, "we have now a room with the right polish, the right clay, and the right habit. Our unknown brings to the river not only a feather and a dish, but an instrument meant to travel, a case to set on a rail, a lanyard to tap the brass, a clock to lie. There remains the hand that carries them and the mouth that breathes the acrid ghost we smelled, to Vale House. You would confront the valet? I would listen to him while Lestrade asks his plainer questions. Bostock's trade is to see what his master would rather not, and to say he has seen nothing of valuable man until someone else values him more." Our driver turned his horse toward Belgravia. The fog began to thicken again, as if the Thames, jealous of our audacity, had set about muffling the very streets through which we passed. Holmes sat forward, eyes half closed, and beat with one finger, very softly, the tattoo we had heard on the river, the nervous message of brass to brass. Vale House presented itself to Belgravia with that calm rectitude which only old money and new paint can achieve. The steps had been scrubbed to a pallor, the brass shone with housemaid zeal, and somewhere in the back regions someone was taking out misfortune in the only permissible way, by polishing it. Lestrade's hansom had forestalled us. His hat lay upon a marble console in the hall beside a pair of gloves, so neatly placed that I knew at once they were not his. A butler of the school that can reject an invading army with a lifted eyebrow conducted us to a morning room whose tall windows received what light the London day had to spare. Lady Theodosia, still veiled, rose at our entrance, acknowledged Holmes and myself by name, and indicated Lestrade with a small motion as though to say, "The law is here. Govern yourselves accordingly." "You may speak before all of us, Bostock," she said, when the butler had withdrawn and the valet had been ushered in behind him. "You will answer the gentleman's questions exactly. You may omit nothing." Bostock was one of those discreet English faces upon which self-effacement has left its watermark. His eyes were pale, his hair receding, his hands, very clean, hung like careful tools at his sides. There was, I confess, something in that very blamelessness which put me on my guard. Holmes did not take a chair. He stood where he could see both the valet and the light upon the window, and spoke with a gentleness that I had learned to mistrust. It always meant a probe was about to enter living tissue. "Your master dined at home last evening, Mr. Bostock?" "At 8:30, sir." "And left the house?" "At 9:25. His lordship was in evening dress with a heavy cloak. He wore the swan pin which her ladyship has, and took his travelling writing-case with him." "A writing-case," Holmes repeated, and I saw the merest glint. "Describe it." "Black morocco, sir. Narrow. The kind folds open on a lap for correspondence. It holds pens, a little inkwell, and the like." His lordship admired neatness. "Indeed. Did you replenish the inkwell yesterday?" "I did, sir. From a cake we grind, lamp-black in gum. The house prefers it for notes." "It does not smear?" Holmes turned his head a fraction toward me. He might as well have shouted. "And gloves?" he continued. "His lordship wore a new pair to dine," Bostock said. "He changed them before he went out. They are in his dressing-room, unused." "Who repaired his older pair?" Holmes asked, almost idly. "A notch here." He touched the second joint of his own left forefinger. "Can be mended, but not prettily." Bostock's gaze did not flicker. "Mendings are sent out, sir." "Very good. Did your master instruct a carriage?" "He walked, sir. He said he would take the air. He was—" Here the neutrality of the servant failed a shade. "He was pleased. It is not my place to judge, sir, but I have known his lordship in all humours these 12 years, and last night he was pleased." Lestrade shifted in his chair. "With what, Bostock?" "I cannot say, sir." "Whom did he expect?" Bostock looked at Lady Theodosia. She lifted her veiled face as if offering him the shelter of her name. "No one, Inspector." Holmes's tone did not change. "You were at his dressing-table after dinner?" "Yes, sir." "You set aside an invitation card for him. Small, embossed bird." Bostock's hands tightened once and were still. "I set it aside with others, sir, to be filed." "And burnt," Holmes said, and this time he did not phrase it as a question. The valet's pallor shifted. "We burn rough drafts, sir." "Show me the basket." Lady Theodosia's veil turned a fraction. Lestrade glanced at Holmes, frowned, and then gestured to Bostock, who conducted us through the adjoining door into a dressing-room so immaculate that one felt an intruder merely by breathing. The waste-paper basket had been emptied, but the grate, though swept, retained the briefest record of last night's confidences. A char at the edge of a fragment thick enough to have resisted the poker, a bead of wax hardened upon the andiron, and in the ash itself the faintest curve of a raised rim, like a negative of a dish that had stood too long in one place. Holmes did not crouch. He stooped in a single precise hinge and lifted, with the point of his penknife, the charred fragment. It was enough, a corner of stout card, the ghost of a bird impressed upon it, and upon the blank a smear of dead black that the grate had not quite consumed. "Your lamp-black travels faithfully, Mr. Bostock," he said quietly. "Who brought the invitations into the house 3 weeks ago?" "The porter from the Adelphi, sir," Bostock answered promptly. That was either truth or practice. We receive many packages. Of course, a boy would know the way by now. He slid the fragment into an envelope and turned to the andiron. "This wax bead, household wax?" "For the household seals, sir." "Not jet?" "No, sir." Holmes's glance flicked to the valet's hands for the first time. They were ungloved. He took Bostock's left softly, turned it palm up, then back again. There was no scar at the second joint. only a faint reddening across the knuckles that showed a habit of polishing silver. "Thank you," he said, as if releasing a patient. "You will oblige me, Mr. Bostock, by recalling whether your master returned a key to his ring before he left." "He did not, sir." "And the key to the launch?" "The river keys hang in the hall press, sir. His lordship kept a copy in his coat." "I cannot say which he took." "When he walked out, did he pass the front?" "The side, sir," Bostock said, and now the smallest shade of reluctance crept into his voice. "We have a gate into the mews. His lordship liked to avoid notice." Holmes nodded as if he had been told what he expected. We returned to the morning room. Lady Theodosia had not moved. She might have been a figure carved in pale stone, but for the intelligence that warmed and cooled in turns behind the veil. "My husband did not meet a courtesan on the river," she said, with that economy of words which makes denial stronger than law. "Nor a blackmailer. If there was folly, it was not that sort." Holmes's face was mild. "Madam, I collect follies as a botanist collects mosses. I make no moral arrangements among them. Did Lord Vale keep a secretary?" "Mr. Felix Hargreave," she answered with the faintest hesitation, "has had the management of my husband's correspondence for a year. He attends at 11. Lestrade made a note with unnecessary firmness. "We shall speak to him." Holmes drifted as if idly to the window and pushed the curtain a finger's breadth aside. "Mr. Bostock," he said, still looking out, "was there ever a small narrow case in this house, 2 feet long, smooth, with a brass catch, brought in or out at night by the side gate?" Bostock's silence sharpened the fog. Lady Theodosia's hand stirred upon the edge of the chair. "Say it," she murmured. "It is not for me," Bostock began, and then, with that fatal honesty of servants who cannot bear to see a duty untidy. "There is such a case, sir. It was used for a decorative piece, the head and neck, sir, of a swan carved in ebony, with a hinge, for table centres at certain dinners. It is an emblem." Holmes's smile had no pleasure in it. "And the base of that emblem?" "A plinth, sir, of porcelain. The head locks upon it." "Ah." He let the curtain fall. "And Mr. Hargreave?" "At 11, Lady Theodosia repeated. The veil turned toward us, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost a degree of its armour. "Mr. Holmes, I understand you less and trust you more. Tell me this, did he suffer?" "I do not think he suffered long," Holmes said simply. "Pain is a noisy conspirator, and the room was too orderly for it." A bell sounded far in the house. Lestrade glanced at the mantel clock. "That will be Hargreave." The secretary entered with the air of a man to whom rooms, people, and crises arrange themselves in lines that only he can see. He was of medium height, well-favoured without being handsome, and carried his right shoulder an inch higher than his left, which gave him an attitude of perpetual carefulness. His gloves were in his hand rather than upon it. When he bowed to Lady Theodosia, a muscle tightened in his jaw, like a rider holding the curb on a skittish horse. "I came as soon as I received the dreadful message," he said. "Madam," he faltered, found a safer shore. "Inspector?" "You desired my attendance?" Lestrade's questions were proper and pedestrian. Last letters, engagements, creditors. Hargreave's answers were smooth. He knew the day book. He named men whose faces I could have drawn from the city columns. He deplored without committing himself to sorrow. It was Holmes who, at the pause, inserted a single thread. "Mr. Hargreave, you favour the left hand." The secretary blinked. "No." "Then your glove-maker has wronged you," Holmes said pleasantly, taking up the pair upon the console as if in absent-minded admiration. He held the left glove up to the pale light, and there, neat as a surgeon's stitch, was a repair at the second joint of the forefinger. An old scar? Hargreaves' gaze did not flicker. He extended the bare hand. There was, indeed, a pale crescent across the joint, an old wound that would not carry guilt for any but the guilty. "A schoolboy's folly," he said. "Fencing." "In the left hand," Holmes observed, returning the glove. "You must have been a tiresome adversary." "I am tiresome now," Hargreave returned, with a smile that went to no depth. "How can I assist you? I have the keys for the correspondence safe and the cipher books for the trust." Holmes inclined his head. "Presently." He lifted his eyes to Lady Theodosia. "Madam, with your leave, I should like to see the side gate and the press in the hall where the river keys are kept." She rose at once. "Take what you require." Her hand brushed the chair as she passed. One black thread caught for an instant upon the carved arm, and then drifted free. It was very fine, and it gleamed against the carpet before a draught took it. I could not say why that small escape disturbed me, unless it was that it answered too closely to the frayed ribbon Holmes had carried across his glove. We went down. The butler produced the press, in which hung, upon two separate nails, a labelled key for Swan and one for Launch. The side door gave upon a strip of cobbles and then the mews. Holmes stood there a moment, studying the damp, and stooped to lift from the inner sill a suggestion of pale powder as thin as breath. "Clay," he said very softly, "and not Belgravia's." He straightened, and his voice, when he spoke, had that absent, dangerous lightness which told me the music had begun in his head and would not leave us until it was finished. "Inspector, you will post a man at this door by night. Mr. Hargreave, you will dine at home and be seen to do so. Lady Theodosia, if there is a note, any note, delivered today, bearing a bird, you will send it to Baker Street at once. Watson, we have just time to pay our respects to a chemist who sells better morals in bottles than most men find in churches." "Morals?" I repeated as we regained the street. "Courage for cowards, silence for talkers, and sleep for the guilty," he said. "There is a smell on the Swan that is not of gas. If I am right, our midnight was mixed by daylight in a shop off St. James's, and the man who bought it will have left
More than coin on the counter." The shop Holmes chose stood in a discreet angle off St. James's Street, its polished panes modestly declaring chemist and druggist, as if to apologize for the necessary sins within. A bell tinkled with a sobriety that would not have disturbed a sick room. Behind the counter, a gentleman with iron-grey whiskers and the stoop of one who has read labels all his life looked up with patient intelligence. "Good morning," Holmes said, laying his card upon the glass. "I am concerned with a matter in which ether, chloral, or their cousins may have been purchased recently, cash, and in a quantity inconvenient for toothache." The chemist did not affect surprise. His sort are trained to recognize a tone that means one trades with the law for the sake of one's conscience. "There are cousins enough," he returned. "But ether is the relative who leaves a smell in the parlour. We sold a pint to a gentleman 8 days ago and a half pint 3 days since, best sulphuric, in tin with screw cap. He added a sponge and a little face piece of India rubber, such as some physicians use for nervous operations." "A face piece," Holmes repeated pleasantly. "Not a clover." "No, sir, we keep none of those admirable engines," he replied, with dry professional pride. This was a simple cup with strap, a poor man's cowardice. Holmes's eyes rested a fraction longer on the man's hands. "Your ledger would confirm the dates. I will not ask for the name. You do not have it. I will ask for your memory. A left-hand glove, perhaps, repaired at the forefinger, a scar there half glimpsed." The chemist hesitated.
and then, like Greaves and the costumer before him, surrendered to the neatness of the suggestion. Gloves, yes, he kept them on. People do when they mean to carry something unwholesome away. He smelt faintly of varnish. It is a smell clerks in good houses have about them. He wrote upon a card to request that the parcel be wrapped very secure. His card bore some device, bird or such. Black, Holmes said softly. I could not swear to colour, the chemist admitted, but my boy got a smut upon his finger when he handled it. Gum-lac, rather than oil. We used a drop of spirits to remove it. Spirits improve much that men smear, Holmes murmured. You will oblige me with the tin pattern you supplied and a scrap of the strap. Both were produced from stock. Holmes examined the cap, sniffed it, and made a small private calculation in the air with the forefinger of his right hand, the way a violinist measures a phrase. He paid, thanked the chemist, in a tone that made gratitude sound like a scientific conclusion, and we were back in the pale day. You see it, Watson? He said, as we turned our steps toward Baker Street. The acrid ghost in the cabin, the orderly air, the face undisturbed, ether to invite sleep, chloral to make it obedient, the bell cord painted for the eye of the police, and the clock taught to say the word that the newspapers love. There is, in this case, a mind which loves arrangements. And the facepiece? I asked. Strapped and removed before the noise, he said. No drops in the glass, because the coward's cordial was administered upon a sponge. No residue upon the lips, because ether's kiss is not an ink. Yet a faint breath of it kept the room company until the wind displaced it through the broken door. The tin we carry will tell us whether the chemist's cap and the ghost at the river are cousins indeed. Back at Baker Street, our fire, obedient to Mrs. Hudson's good governance, had made the room habitable. Holmes set his purchases upon the table with the care of a man laying instruments for a delicate operation. Then from a drawer he took tiny labelled vials and a strip of clean muslin. He uncapped the tin and held it beneath his nose for a heartbeat only. His lids drooped. He touched the cap with a dampened swab, dried it before the coals, and then, with the same swab, stroked a minute strip he had cut from the inside hem of his own cuff, where, on the launch, he had briefly pressed fabric against the bull's eye in a motion I had noticed but not understood. Simple colour test, he said lightly, seeing my curiosity. Ether leaves little, but not nothing. It stirs certain reagents to a delicate pink that pleases the eye. Now, our lamp-black. He opened Greaves's little bottle. A thread of the gum-bound black, dissolved in water, made a stain upon paper. Holmes touched the bell-cord smear on his glove with a second swab, then married the two upon a plate. The unromantic chemistry of gum, lamp soot, and dilution produced precisely the dull, reluctant grey we had seen upon the cord. So, he said, our painter of bells patronizes both printer and chemist. The same mind again. Now for the clay. He crushed a few grains between glass, added a drop, and peered through his lens. Fine yellowish, with a flake or two of mica, river drift adulterated by yard, not bank. I would swear to the Armitage Court and to the sill at Vale House by sympathy. The case we seek, 2 feet long for the ebony head, rested where Jem's broom never quite reaches. I confess that as he worked, my old familiar admiration came upon me with the warmth of a fire after bivouac. The steps seemed to me to follow one another with the honesty a nervous system has when it reports pain. No exaggeration, only the insistent truth. Here was no conjurer's trick. Here was the clean unfolding of cause and sign. We had barely set aside the apparatus when there came a brisk clap at the knocker, followed by the scuff of a boy who had been paid enough to run. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face arranged at once to be impressed and to be sceptical. "A note, Mr. Holmes, from Vale House by the lad's tail." He could not read the direction for the smut on it. Holmes took the envelope with a hand that did not appear to hurry and held it to the light before breaking the seal. The bird was there, embossed, and the ink upon it dead black. Within, upon a single small sheet, were the words, "Armitage, tonight, midnight, last meeting, bring nothing but silence." Holmes's mouth tightened at one corner. "The theatre wishes its audience," he said. "They have decided on an epilogue." "Lestrade should be told," I observed. "He will be, after I have chosen his seat." There is a tone in the word last that does not belong to idiots. They intend consequently. It is our task to make consequence serve us. He touched the bell for a messenger, wrote 3 swift notes, one to Lestrade, one to the landlord of the Armitage rooms, and one, after a moment's pause, to Lady Theodosia, sealed them with quick, neat movements, and sent the boy at a pace that satisfied both his purse and his impatience. "You will go in disguise," I said. "I shall go as what I am," he returned. "A man who can be tolerated in any room if he promises to leave it cleverer than he entered. But I do not propose to present the yard to the stage until the cue is given. You, my dear Watson, will choose a revolver that does not insist upon conversation, and a coat that does not catch on stair rails. We shall have a draftsman's darkness to work in, and men who have practised secrecy as others practice scales." He had scarcely finished speaking when the second knock came, short, official. Lestrade walked in without ceremony and read the note in a single sweep. "So they gather," he said. "Do we net them?" "Only the fish that choose to bite," Holmes returned. "The rooms must be ready, the yard swept, the side door latched, the landlord primed to idiocy. Your men will take the mews and the lane. No one moves until I touch my handkerchief to the window. If I do not, you will wait until you hear 3 taps, slow, upon the brass vent cap. You have heard that rhythm?" "Like a lanyard on a plate," Lestrade said grimly. "I have it." "Good. If you rush a flock, they take wing. I would have them preen first." Lestrade eyed him. "And Hargreave?" "Dines at home and sits with a book where any man may see him through the blinds," Holmes replied. "I have asked Lady Theodosia to contrive a dinner that will delay him exactly as long as it would please her to be delayed. We shall see whether his left forefinger itches to turn a door key at 11. The hour that followed we spent in those quiet preparations, which make noise later, cartridges checked, a short length of silk cord in Holmes's pocket for work, I did not question, a tiny vial whose odour warned me that he had compounded a stimulant against Ether's cousin should one of us inhale more courage than we intended. He locked a drawer with care and, after a thoughtful glance at the violin, left it upon the mantel, as one nods to a friend who must sit out the evening. Dusk fell as a silk scarf falls, without sound and with intent. When we stepped into the street, the fog had drawn in close, reducing London to a set of confidences exchanged between lamps. In the cab, Holmes was very still. I have come to know that stillness. It is the hush before a hawk drops. Only once he spoke, and then it was not to me, but to the night. "They will think," he said, "that midnight makes them invisible. It only teaches the clock to lie. We shall tell it the truth." We took up our stations in due time. Lestrade and his men faded into their appointed shadows. The landlord, with a face like a man who had agreed to host a ghost, blinked at us once and disappeared. Room B awaited, polished, old-waxed, with candles unlit, and the sideboard prepared as if for gentility. Holmes glanced at the window, tried the latch in silence. and then, with a movement so economical that it seemed to cost him nothing at all, slid into the corner beside the hearth where the rug-speckled clay printed its moth-wing dark upon the pile. I felt the dull, familiar leap of the pulse a man hears in his ears on the outpost line. The city seemed to suspend its breath. Somewhere far off a bell tolled the quarter. Holmes's hand, very faintly, counted 3 upon the carpet. Then he leaned towards me, so close that his whisper was a warmth rather than a word. "Listen," he said, and in the passage beyond the door, distinct, deliberate, came the soft, bald sound of a key trying its virtue in an old lock. The key tried once, withdrew, then returned with the minute confidence of a man whose hand has learned the tumblers by practice. The door eased inward upon a careful inch, a folded wash of darkness edged in. The newcomer waited there, listening with that patience which is the difference between a thief and a fool. Satisfied, he slid within and closed the door to the same hair's breadth, as though a draught might betray him before his own breath did. He had a shuttered lantern, whose beam he disciplined with 2 fingers, letting it write swift, silent commas upon table and sideboard. He was neat. The lantern kissed the candlesticks, counted, notched in some private reckoning, paused upon the hearth-rug, where the speckled clay was ground in a moth's pattern, and then climbed to the window latch. He tried it, found it obedient, and drew it down to the last, soundless fraction. His shoes were thin and left no vulgar wet upon the boards. When he moved, his right shoulder led the left by a shade. Holmes had not stirred. He sat so still that I should have thought him a shadow carved into the corner if I had not known the precise economy of his stillness. The newcomer set his lantern on the floor, opened the door again, and admitted a second figure, a woman, tall, with a veil drawn and her step held with effort to silence, for a woman's skirts betray more readily than a man's boots. Between them they bore the long, narrow case I had seen. In my mind's eye, since Jem's nod, the smooth black box with brass catch, and set it, as Jem had described, for an instant upon the window rail. The woman winced at the faintest rasp of hinge on varnish, and shifted it to the table with an urgency that told me habit had not dulled fear. They opened the case. From its cushioned bed, the head and neck of a swan, carved in black, rose with a sinister grace, the hinge at the base designed to marry some porcelain plinth. The woman's gloved hand, left, found the catch by instinct. As she bent, the lantern's permission gave me one detail only, a pinhole stain darkening the kid at the base of the forefinger where the pressure would come. Cheap powder lay like frost upon the veil's edge, and when she turned the faint scent of it, French and cloying, reached us even where we hid. She set the head upon a low dish drawn from her bag, one of Pottle's plain china pieces, and smoothed a length of black ribbon to trail from the curve of the neck like a leash. The man drew from his pocket a packet of cards, white and thick. He counted them, laid them in a sheaf, and placed them at the end of the table as an officiant at some grim altar might set his missals. His left glove showed a repair, neat, precisely where Greaves had remembered the notch. He did not remove it. He lifted 2 masks, dominoes with cheap ribbon ties, the ribbons poor and beginning to fray, and set them ready. Then, with a movement that was as much habit as caution, he tried the bell pull. His thumb came away grey. He looked at it with irritation, as if at an old mistake, took out a handkerchief and wiped the smear with the quick, efficient motion of a man who cannot bear disorder in his symbols. Holmes's hand ghosted once against my sleeve. I knew the meaning and held my breath anew. A third key turned. 2 men entered together, whispering in that emphatic undertone which seeks to be quiet without surrendering importance. A fourth followed them, then a fifth and sixth. None removed his gloves. Each took a mask and tied it, bows deft and low. The room breathed a little heavier. There is a point at which secrecy generates its own heat. We felt it then. When a seventh came, the last, he locked the door, counted, and nodded to the man with the repaired glove. The woman had placed herself to the side, her hands upon the Swan's neck, as though steadying a living thing. In that position, her height was marked. She was taller than any man there save one. "Brothers," said the repaired glove, and his voice had the trained clearness of a reader, "for the last time." The word last fell with the weight of an anvil dropped from a measured height. It did not clang, it thudded into felt. "You have seen the papers," he continued. "We have the river with us in this if we keep our heads." Vale broke the circle. He threatened us with virtue after profiting by our courage. His name has gone before him. We will send his gospel
After. Tonight we close the book and the bill. He nodded to the woman. She drew from beneath the table a tin, the twin of that which Holmes had bought that morning, and an India rubber cup with strap. She set them down without fuss, as a nurse lays out her patient's piece. One of the men quivered and looked away. The reader's mouth curved. He did not look at the tin. He did not need to. "You will burn the ledger," said a voice from the back, thin with tension. "All of it?" "All," the reader returned. "The names remain with us who took the oath. If one man goes down, he goes alone. That is the pledge." "And the funds?" "The funds are in motion," the reader said. "What I have done I will answer for afterwards. Tonight we perform the rite, we break the seal, we part." The woman's hand rested for an instant upon the Swan's head. In that breath the cheap powder exhaled again, and I saw Holmes's nostrils scarcely quiver. The reader opened the writing case I now saw upon the chair. It was Lord Vale's narrow morocco, its pockets as tidy as Bostock's honesty could make them. From a hidden sleeve he slid a little book, bound in black, its gilt worn at two corners. The ledger, if ledger it was. He placed it upon the porcelain base and lifted the Swan's head as if to bite. The hinge admitted the book. The head closed. The emblem sat now as an idol enthroned upon its altar, with the living hands that served it visible only when they dared. "Midnight," said the reader, "and silence." He took a plain clock from his pocket, wound it once, and set it on the table, face inward, so that the hands told time to himself alone. The woman fixed the strap of the cup, doused the sponge in the tin with the practiced carelessness of one who has learned the weights by feel, wrung it, and held the cup ready. The reader drew a seat to the head. He did not sit. He merely arranged it. Then, methodical in his deliberation, lifted the handbell from the sideboard, the bell that would summon a servant in a decent house, and set it a little out of reach. Holmes's forefinger wrote a single shape upon the carpet. Now. I felt rather than saw his handkerchief stir. He did not show it at the window yet. He slipped it into his cuff. The seconds, those ostlers of drama, fell with patient duty. The reader inclined his head. "Witness the rites," he said. "Witness and be silent." "You will not," Holmes observed, and his voice, though low, ran across the table like a blade's thin light. There was a fraction of stillness. I confess the pleasure I took in that pause. The reader's head came up at once. The lanterns swung. The beam wrote a bright, heartless stripe across Holmes's face as he rose from the hearth's shadow with the inevitability of a figure pressed out of wood by a printer's screw. "We have waited on your courage," Holmes continued, the silk cord loose in his left hand, his right open and visible. "We admired your arrangements. We come now to improve them." The woman's hand darted to the tin.
Holmes's left moved before she had time to understand movement. The silk bit her wrist and the cup slid harmlessly to the rug. The reader gave a single word, no more than a breath of go, and two men leapt for the side window. Their mistake was old. Men think the same escape saves them twice. The latch jammed on the fraction Holmes had left it. The first man's shoulder jarred it, and in that jar I saw the precise degree to which Holmes had foreseen the degree of their courage. The reader, efficient even in surprise, flung the writing case into the woman's bag and reached for the Swan's head, perhaps to swing it as a club, perhaps to gather it like an infant. He was quick. Holmes was quicker. With that same economy which at once delights and terrifies, my friend's right hand turned the head's hinge upon its centre, and the thing came free without violence, the pin that locked it, giving to a pressure that knew where men's eyes did not. "Watson," he said conversationally, and I had the relief of acting within a plan rather than in hot haste. I had the revolver already in my fist. If any gentleman supposes himself immune to the law, oblige him with a different supposition. The door-handle twisted like a living creature under sudden strength. The lock, being old, yielded with a crack, and the passage filled with the quick, unmistakable steps of the yard. Lestrade himself was first, his men like a tide behind him. The reader froze, measured what he would gain by gesture, and elected a stillness as deliberate as any he had practised in entering. Two of the men made the first foolish rush and were thrown back by Lestrade's compact weight and a constable's arm used honestly. The woman, to her credit, stood without struggling, her wrist still neatly bound by Holmes's silk. She was looking not at the officers, but at the Swan's head in Holmes's hand, as though calculation might yet persuade it to fly. "Felix Hargreave," Lestrade said without triumph to the reader, "you will come with me." The repaired glove did not tremble. The eyes above the mask, grey, considered Lestrade with a calm which had survived dinners, ledgers, and at least one midnight. He put his hands out for the cuffs, as a gentleman yields his coat to a valet. "I shall," he said. "You have the wrong bird, Inspector, but the right pond." "Save your rivers for the magistrate," Lestrade returned. "Gently," Holmes said, as two constables bent to lift the woman's bag. "A porcelain plinth cracks easily if treated as a boot-scraper." Lestrade's mouth twitched. "We'll wrap your altar, Mr. Holmes, with all the respect due the devil's furniture." He looked round, satisfied that the room's exits obeyed him, and then nodded to me. "Your revolver is as neat as ever, Doctor. If you will let my men relieve you of some of your valour, we will carry the rest to Bow Street." It would have been, in ordinary circumstance, a clean net. But the city is a player in every London case, and that night she claimed her throw. As the constables formed the little procession, the woman between, Hargreave before, two at the rear with the case, there came from the court outside a cry and the sudden shiver of a horse startled into motion. A barrowman, seeing police where the discreet should not be, backed his load with a clatter. The fog took that clatter and made of it confusion. In that single, human muddle, a masked figure who had held himself prudent until then broke for the passage like a rabbit for a hedge. Holmes did not pursue. He turned, and with two sure, cool taps of his knuckle struck the brass vent cap where the lanyard had once kept vigil. The sound rang into the night exactly as he had promised it should. But the fugitive's haste had not been counted on. He took the side door at a bound, shouldered a man who had been stationed a foot too far to the left, and vanished into the mews with that terrible speed men find when fear pays for it in advance. The others did not take his counsel. Panic rarely inspires unanimity. Lestrade's men closed, the cuffs sang, and sense returned to most of them as soon as iron kissed wrist. Holmes stood very still, listening past the constable's breathing and the woman's silence. Somewhere out in the veiled street, quick feet beat a message we could not read. He did not look at me. He looked at the swan's head and at the feather he plucked from within it, black, narrow, and left there like a forgetful god's signature. "Not finished," he said, so low that I barely heard it amidst the rattle of the door and the first formal words of arrest. "Not finished by half. The ledger is not in the head, Lestrade. It never was. They fed you theatre again." "Then what in heaven's name—" began Lestrade. "And why a woman holds herself so still when a certain name is not spoken," Holmes finished, his gaze drifting for the first time to the tall, veiled figure who had not flinched, even now. "We have caught the officiant. We have not yet caught the author. Bring your fish in, and keep your side door man awake. The river's current is not the only thing that moves a boat when the banks look asleep." We went out into the fog with our captives and our fragments. The night had not altered its face. It would never do us that favour. But I felt, as I have felt at other such hours, the wire of Holmes's attention tighten rather than slacken when part of the net held and part of it failed. He is never so alive as when the truth has afforded him a second act. Bow Street received our procession with that tolerant efficiency which has seen too much of London's ingenuity to be astonished by its latest hymn. Hargreave declined a chair. As politely as he accepted the handcuffs, he gave his name, his office, and nothing that resembled a confession. The veiled woman spoke when addressed, and otherwise preserved that rigid quiet which is either courage or calculation. Holmes, who could prick a balloon without touching it, asked nothing at all until Lestrade had done with the preliminaries. "Your club," he said then to Hargreave, as if the word were a detail of a gentleman's wardrobe, styled itself for a bird rare upon the Thames, and rarer still in virtue. Men joined to exchange favours, not feathers. Vale proposed to pull the pin from the hinge. Hargreave's grey eyes met his without heat. Vale proposed a drama. We obliged him with a stage. "And yet your stage lacked its principal property," Holmes returned. "You brought the head, Mr. Hargreave, but not the base." The secretary did not blink. "You seem to know the furniture as intimately as a steward." "Intimacy is my trade," Holmes murmured. "Where is the ledger?" "In your imagination," said Hargreave, and his voice, not insolent but toneless, made the lie sound tired rather than bold. Holmes glanced at the woman. "Madam, no, do not trouble with a false name. Your powder is poor and your glove cheap. You are not Lady Theodosia. You will tell the inspector where you purchased the strap and the tin." She lifted her veiled head and, for the first time, looked directly at Holmes. There was resentment in the gaze and a certain grudging admiration. "At Prentice's," she said. "The chemist off St. James's. For 2 shillings I carried what gentlemen could not be seen to buy. And for 2 guineas I held my tongue." Holmes bowed the least fraction. "You may have occasion to spend both." Lestrade, content that he possessed names to accompany wrists, dispatched his men with the prisoners to the cells, and turned back to us with that prickly satisfaction an honest terrier shows when he has both collars and a lingering scent under his nails. "You will give me the book tonight, Mr. Holmes," he said, not as a request. "I will give you something," Holmes replied. "Whether it is a ledger or the man who carries it, I cannot yet say." He touched his fingers together, not quite a steeple, and I saw that the inward music had changed key. "You posted a man at Vale House?" "2," said Lestrade. "Side door and mews." Before he could add a boast, the deck sergeant's bell, spoke sharply, and a constable from the Belgravia beat, damp with fog and temper, was thrust into the room like a fact through a hypothesis. "Inspector Vale House!" cry from the mews. Our man jostled and down, side press forced, one key missing. Holmes did not move quickly. He ceased to be still. "Which key?" "The one labelled Swan," the man panted. "The other hangs. I'm sent to—" "To finish the sentence with your conscience," Holmes said, already in motion. "Watson, Coat, Lestrade, your neatest man and none of your uniforms, the bird which took wing at Armitage has remembered his nest." We were in a cab and shot like a pellet from a tube before Lestrade's objection had decided whether to be borne. The horse's iron rang the quarters of our haste upon the stones. Holmes said nothing until the embankment opened like a cold lung before us. Then, "He thinks speed will serve him better than stealth now. He believes us occupied with Hargreave. He will take a boat where boats are dumb. The midnight Swan makes no gossip if one speaks her language." Mill Bank crouched in its fog. The launch lay as we had left her, seeming, in that viscous light, to have been painted on the water. The constable on watch, young, honest, too broad of shoulder for the narrow gangplank, reported with shame that he had stepped aside to answer a woman's cry from the stairs. In that breath, a man had gone past him like smoke. "Which way?" "Down, sir. Not 20 heartbeats ago." Holmes wheeled, and for a beat I thought he would take the water like a river rat. Instead, he clipped the constable in a phrase. "Blow your whistle and do not budge. If your man returns, let him find the same problem." Then to me, "No heroics, Watson. Follow exactly." We crossed. The split door yielded. The cabin breathed out a different cold. Air kissed by a recently opened window, and closed again, the kind of chastity burglars practice when they fancy themselves artists. The bell cord showed a new smear, brighter, not yet dried to dull. Upon the inlaid table the little porcelain dish sat where I had last seen it, and yet absurdly it sat with presence, as if it had acquired mass. Holmes's hand, precise as a surgeon's, slid beneath and lifted. He weighed it once, and his eyes, in that instant, were not merely bright, they were satisfied. "He did not have time," he said. "For what?" "To exchange the altar's base for its twin," Holmes answered. "Feel." The dish we saw days ago was the dish of a sweetmeat, honest and light. This one is heavy with a centre of something that pretends to be porcelain, but echoes like a shell filled with coin. He set it down and drew the blade of his penknife along the inner rim. The steel kissed wax. Even in that cold I caught the ghost of a ceiling scent, domestic and out of place amid whiskey and varnish. "Household wax on the andiron at Vale House, remember," he murmured, half to me, half to the river. "A lady burns draughts, a valet empties ash, a clever man warms a bead, and makes a seam disappear to any eye but mine." He took up the dish with both hands and, with a quick twist, found the faintest give where a craftsman's pride had failed the man who ordered him. The inner plate turned off like the lid of a snuff-box. Beneath lay a coil of black ribbon that had been cut not by scissors, but by tearing, ragged, cheap. And in its centre, a book the size of a glove, bound in black, the gilt worn at 2 corners. Holmes did not touch it at once. He placed the dish very gently upon the table so that it made no sound. Then his hand closed upon the book, and he lifted it to the light. When he opened it, the sound the pages made was not ink. It was a choir of names. Sums appeared as though they had been waiting for the air. Dates, initials, places, payments to and from, little marks like feathers to indicate oaths taken and favours bought. "Lestrade," he said quietly, though Lestrade was not yet in the room. "If you must have spectacles, borrow mine for this. They look both ways at once." He turned a leaf. There is our baronet of Riverworks, with a figure that would make a hospital blush. There is a clerk who should never have held a key. There is... He paused. His finger rested for an instant upon a line neat as any accounting might wish for. It read, in a sure hand, TV, and a sum beside it, then a second, smaller sum underlined. The marks beside were not the little feathers. They were a swan's head, and beside it a tiny eye inked in with pinpoint care. Temptation is a poor initial, Holmes said, and truth is worse, but the ledger is honest in its vanity. It cannot resist a private jest. The eye is a debt called in. Whose? I asked, keeping my voice as steady as the river allowed. Not Theodosia, if that comforts you, he replied, and this time his mouth acknowledged what his words would not. Her hand deals in oaths, not arithmetic. This TV paid and then paid again. Someone called in a favour at a price. We will learn whose monogram turns at that angle. He closed the book and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat with a movement that was as much concealment as possession. We are ahead by minutes only. Our rabbit, finding the hutch empty, will double back for teeth. Come. On the deck, the fog had thickened and drawn the sound of the city into the curious hush in which each footstep seems to be the sole remaining conversation in London. We gained the embankment. A figure detached itself from the river stairs, a man whose hat brim hid his face and whose right shoulder led the left by a shade. He saw us and did not flee. He halted by the stone 2 yards beyond any decent lamplight and spoke in a voice meant to belong to no one. "You are quick, Mr. Holmes." "Quicker than your friend at Armitage," Holmes returned. He ran where you would have waited. Patience is a rarer cowardice. The man's gloved hand, left, shifted as if itching. "You have my book." "I have a book," Holmes said, "and your arithmetic is written in it. If you like, we will agree between ourselves what the magistrate should not learn. I am not an enemy to private reformations when they are bought dearly enough." He laughed then, a brief, sane sound. "You propose to blackmail a blackmailer?" "I propose to remove from London a lever with which too many doors have been opened and too many women have been forced to stand very still," Holmes said. "If I can do it with fewer ruined households than you had in mind, I will not blush." "You have not the right," the man said, and there was passion in him now, edged and controlled. "There are men in that book who will never stand in a dock because their pockets are too deep and their dinners too well attended. Vale tried to preach to us from his boat while he fed at our table. I chose theatre because truth is a poor playwright." "And killed him?" Holmes asked, so softly that the fog itself seemed to listen. The man's head tilted by the fractional degree that means a decision has just chosen its next breath. "Vale died of his own vanity," he said. "He wished to see the swan's eye close while he sat like Caesar. He took the cup because he trusted the emblem to be gentler than a rope. I closed the clock." "You smeared the cord," Holmes said. "You painted morality where mercy would have done." "I made a lesson," the man answered, and in that instant I understood that he did not regard himself as a villain. He regarded himself as a pedagogue. Holmes's handkerchief stirred in his cuff and then did not appear. He had heard what he needed. He turned his head the slightest fraction, and I knew that somewhere behind me, beyond a respectful fog, Lestrade's neatest man had crept to his mark. "You will come with us quietly," Holmes said. "Your patience can do one more trick." The man shifted his weight, not to run, but like a fencer measuring the length of a lunge. "If I do," he said, "you will give me the book." "I will give it to the river sooner," Holmes replied. It has been in her confidence long enough to know how to keep a secret. For the first time, the man's control showed a seam. He took a single step toward the stairs, as if the black water would receive his arithmetic and absolve it. In the same breath a hand closed upon his arm from the fog's edge. He twisted, a tight, skilled motion, but Lestrade is a man who plants his feet like a dockside bollard when it matters. The struggle was brief. The man's hat fell. His face found the lamp's fringed circle for an instant, sharp, clever, ordinary, in the way that makes command easy. I had never seen him before. That is London's gift. It hides monsters not in lairs, but in chairs. "Name?" Lestrade demanded. The man lifted his head and looked past us to the river, as men do when they will not look at those who have outwitted them. "If you read the book," he said, "you will find it where it should be." "We have the line," Holmes observed. "We prefer the voice." He said nothing. Lestrade snapped the cuffs, and the moment passed like a dropped stitch, caught again before the pattern noticed. "Bring him," Holmes said. "Gently. He will break for water if you handle him like luggage. And send to Vale House at once. Lady Theodosia will receive a note before dawn. I would rather she saw my face than a bird." We walked back along the embankment with the fog making us into a short, close procession. Holmes's hand rested lightly where the book lay in his coat. His gaze was grave, not with triumph, but with the cost. The lanyard somewhere forward had fallen silent. In my mind, however, it kept up its tapping. There are cases in which you feel the river has not so much been crossed as joined, and this was one. The city, who had watched our little theatre, would want a second performance. Holmes, who hears such demands even when men do not know they are making them, was already writing the next scene in his head. We reached Belgravia before the lamps had quite resigned themselves to mourning. The house stood with its blinds half drawn, as if the night had been invited to remain for decency's sake. A footman, grey with want of sleep, admitted us without question. Lestrade kept his man and our silent prisoner to the hall. Holmes and I were shown at once to the small library, where Lady Theodosia waited in a gown too simple to be fashionable, and therefore, on her, perfectly so. She had dispensed with the veil. Fatigue had not clouded her. It had honed her to the edge at which truth may cut, or be cut by it. Holmes did not sit. He took from his breast the black book and laid it upon the table between us, as a surgeon lays an instrument within reach of light. Lady Theodosia's eyes fell to it once, and then returned to his face. "You recovered it," she said. "And you came yourself. Thank you for both." "Gratitude is currency in which I trade at a loss," Holmes replied. "But I will accept a payment in the form of an answer. You shall have what I can pay." Her glance dropped again, and in that instant I saw, not curiosity, not avarice, but a dislike of being looked at by an object that had learned to look back. "I will not open it." "I do not require you to," said Holmes. "I will show you a single line." He turned the leaves with the lightest of touches and set his finger to the entry he had marked in his mind. "TV," a sum, then a second, underlined, and the small inked eye that had made him pause upon the launch. Lady Theodosia drew in her breath. It was not surprise. It was recognition withheld to the last possible moment. "You see why I did not bring the yard to your drawing-room first," Holmes said gently. "They would have read those letters as I did at the river, and made of them a woman's initials. Your forbearance last night when I spoke of oaths was not for yourself. You were standing very still for someone else." "For something else," she answered. "TV is not a person. It is a chest. Trust, Vale." She spoke the words flatly, without ornament. "When my husband succeeded to his father's affairs, he found certain obligations that could not be met in daylight without ruining households, mostly those of the poor, sometimes those of men whose wives were innocent and whose children did not deserve to eat scandal for supper. It began small, Mr. Holmes. I will not varnish it. A fund to move a servant whose master had been vicious, to buy the silence of a reporter who would not scruple to name a girl, to pay for a lying-in out of town. It was the women I cared for. Alistair, her hand, very steady, made the smallest motion, as if smoothing the nap of a thought. He called it prudence. In time the men around him, men who thrive upon arrangement, found it a lever. Favour for favour. Charity became a bribe dressed for chapel. And when he wished to put an end to it, Holmes said, they taught the clock to lie. He told me 4 nights ago he would dissolve it, she returned. He said he would take his boat and his ledger and be done. I told him he could not be done with such a thing. One must bury it as one buries a plague house, brick upon brick, and the door sealed. Holmes's glance flicked, not to the book, but to the pin at her collar, the little swan whose missing eye had caught his notice at Baker Street. And the sign among you for such sealing was to close the eye. She did not start. She permitted herself the smallest turn of the head, acknowledging a stroke landed. That was my whimsy, she said. When a debt was paid and the favour settled, we would ink a tiny eye beside the swan head in the private copy. It was childish. It made men think in symbols. I see now how easy a sermon theatre makes. Mr. Hargreave took your theatre seriously, I could not help saying. A faint colour touched her cheek at the secretary's name and was gone. Felix is a careful man, she said. He bound the books, he carried messages, he liked his accounts to balance. He detested my chest because it did not. He told my husband as much. I do not say he killed him. I say he loved order where a little mercy requires disorder. Holmes let the slight current of her defence take its course and die upon the shore. The man we took on the embankment, he said, is not careful. He is precise. He believes lessons can redeem men, like figures added and subtracted to produce a moral sum. Such men do not stop at one corpse if the balance sheet demands another line to be put right. That, she said evenly, is why I stood still last night when you looked at me, Mr. Holmes. There are 10 women for whom the wrong sum would mean ruin. If you read aloud in a court what men write in comfortable rooms, names, addresses, sums spat like cherry stones, you will not catch the writer. You will only injure those whom I meant my folly to shelter. Lestrade shall not read, Holmes returned, until I have removed those lines that belong to women. I will give the yard the arithmetic of men, and the figure that matters most to the crown. It is not mercy that stays me, it is policy. A case that begins with a dead peer and a black feather must not end with 10 laundresses named for the edification of
a morning edition. He lifted a forefinger, the breadth of a breath. But you will give me in return the name that belongs to the hand I have not yet caught. There was a payment called in upon your chest, twice, by a man whose sign is a little eye. It is not yours, it is not Vale's, it is not Hargreaves. Lady Theodosia's gaze held his. If I speak it, she said, you will publish him. I will arrest him, Holmes said. There will be enough theatre without my pen. His name, madam. She looked down once more at the book and, for the first time, touched it with one finger, not to open, but to refuse it. Sir Talbot Vere, she said. Member for South Warrington, a man who can stand in the House and speak about reform, with a face like a new coin and a heart like an old debt. He amused my husband, he terrified me. Vere, Holmes repeated, tasting the weight of the syllable. He will not run. He is too fond of his chair. He will send for counsel and ask for an assurance. He will bargain with air. He closed the ledger and slipped it back under his coat, as if darkness were civility for such a thing.
I will have Bostock summon Mr. Vera's servant to ask why his master's left-hand glove has been mended twice in a month. His ring, she said. He wears it inward. The edge nicks the glove. I have seen it. I am not proud that I have seen it. Lestrade had been still with that patience he practices when Holmes is doing a species of surgery that cannot be assisted. He stirred now. I will want this, Vere, he said, and if Hargreave has put a foot wrong, I will have him as well for conspiracy and any other line my clerk can name. You shall, Holmes replied, but not at once and not at breakfast. Give him till noon. He will use the morning to try the only door left to him. He turned to Lady Theodosia. Forgive me that I speak in front of you, but it is your curtain I am drawing. If we proclaim the ledger safe, the man who fled from Armitage will try to fetch it by force. If we proclaim it burnt, he will attempt to recover it by trick. I prefer trick to force. It spares furniture and saves face. She rose. You will do what you must, she said. I will do what I can. If the press thunders, I shall go to the country and remain there until thunder is fashionable again. Mr. Holmes, if you find you cannot spare my women, you will tell me before you tell London. I will tell you, he said. She had taken one step toward the bell when a footman appeared, as if summoned by dread rather than rope. He held out a salver with a single card upon it. Upon the card a bird had been stamped. The black had smeared a little where a careless thumb had tested its dryness. Holmes lifted the card with 2 fingers. Return the eye and all is well, it read. Fail, and the river will know how to keep more than a ledger. The river, Lestrade muttered. What now? Threats? To throw a man in after his book? A woman, Holmes said, and the words were iron. This is not a style men use to terrify men. It is written to reach those who stand still. The phrase I is for you, Lady Theodosia. He supposes you hold the pin and the purse both? She did not tremble. She did not colour. She merely set her palm flat upon the table as if to steady the city with it. Then let him suppose, she said. Tell me what I am to do. Nothing visible, Holmes answered. Permit one maid, your Abigail if you must, to take a sealed packet from Baker Street to St. Catherine's at 11. It will contain a decoy. She will go by omnibus with another woman's shawl and a man's hat in her bandbox. She will be followed. She is meant to be. Lestrade will not be seen to know of it. Lestrade opened his mouth, shut it again, and gave the fractional nod which in that office stood for a handshake. And you? He asked. Which was to say, what theatre do you write for yourself? I, said Holmes, will publish in a place that no editor reads, the face of my window. By 10 there will be rumours that I have destroyed the book to save a lady. The man who fled will come to confirm whether I am a fool or a liar. He will find me both for an hour. He looked to me then, a glance which carried the accustomed burden and pride. Watson, make Baker Street look unguarded and take down the Persian throw from the bow window. It attracts sentimental burglars. Load your revolver and put it where your hand does not have to think. We will wall the ledger when no thief has ever yet found it, beneath Mrs. Hudson's good sense. We left with a speed that made of courtesy a salute rather than a conversation. In the cab, Holmes sat forward, his hands loose upon his knees, his eyes narrowed not in strain, but in design. Vere will wait to see whether his creature retrieves the thing without noise, he said. If not, he will present himself to me as a patriot wronged by a secretary. Bring the Yard to that interview at the wrong moment, and he will fly to the house and cloak himself with a speech. Bring them at the right, and you have your author, I finished, warmed in spite of the cold at the clarity with which the next act assembled itself. Mrs. Hudson bore our instructions with the equanimity of a woman who has seen music shouted at midnight and breakfast served to princes without prior notice. The ledger went into a tin of tea that had never held leaf, and the tin into a place only she and Providence know. A decoy volume of sermons bound in black took its place in Holmes's inner pocket. I drew the curtains to a degree that invited curiosity rather than denied it, and removed the Persian as commanded. Holmes set upon the table the porcelain dish, empty now, and upon it the swan's head. He stood back and considered the stage he had made. "They will send a polite knock first," he said.
"Then a tradesman's knock. Then they will try a tear at the bell wire and blame the landlord. When the latch lifts without complaint, you will see what faith men put in the negligence of others. And when they come, you will be in the bedroom doorway with a pistol that coughs rather than shouts," he said. "I will be an inch below their line of sight with an argument better than either." The clocks of Marylebone, never in agreement, consented to an uneasy half-hour. The street's murmur went by like a cat's tail along a chair leg, unavoidable and comfortless. When the knock came at last, it was, as Holmes had predicted, in the very key of politeness. He did not look up from the book he was not reading. "Come in," he said, and the latch, well oiled by Mrs. Hudson years ago, obeyed like a taught child. The latch yielded as it would to a housemaid with a tea-tray. A man stepped in who had studied the art of being unremarkable until it had become a profession. He wore a tradesman's coat of decent cut, a hat brim neither rakish nor shy, and gloves that had been brushed to uniformity save where, at the edge of the left forefinger, a recent smear dulled the kid as if it had shaken hands with a chimney. He closed the door behind him with that small backwards pressure thieves share with careful butlers. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and he had chosen the pitch of a clerk charged with an errand for a master he fears a little and despises a trifle. From the lady at Belgravia, she is urgent that you restore to her that he hesitated upon the noun like a man tasting an unfamiliar dish. The article. It is dangerous in a gentleman's rooms. Holmes turned a page of the sermons he did not read. "There are a great many dangerous articles in gentlemen's rooms," he observed. "Poker, pistol, and pride. Which does your mistress specify?" "The book," the man said, with the economy of one who has been told not to embroider. "She will answer for it, and for your discretion." Holmes laid the sermons aside with a nicety that made the gesture an insult to the book rather than the man. "She begs for what I have burnt," he returned. "Pray tell her I am a fool who prefers smoke to ink." The man's gaze went, as such gazes do, not to Holmes's face, but to the room's corners, the mantel, the bow window, the table where the porcelain dish and the black swan's head sat like a jest too elaborate for daylight. His eyes checked for a policeman the way a swimmer looks for weeds. Finding none, they returned to Holmes. "Sir," he said, and a shade of emphasis crept in, "I am to bring it away. There is no second errand." Holmes sighed, and to me, who know the difference between his true fatigue and the coat he sometimes wears to disarm, there was something almost sprightly in the performance. "When an errand boy becomes an ultimatum," he murmured, "it is the master who has forgotten his manners. Very well, if there were such a book, if it should be wrapped before it travelled. One cannot carry scandal openly. London catches cold." He rose, went to the table, and with his back half toward the man, drew a slim black volume from his inner pocket, such as a parson might lay upon a sick bed. His fingers, in the act of laying out a sheet of paper, touched the edge of the book as a painter primes a canvas. A faint caress, with the smallest residue
of gum-bound lamp-lack upon his thumb. He dusted the paper with a breath and, with a delicacy that would have done for a christening, wrapped the decoy. "What shall I say to the lady?" the man ventured, and could not keep the eagerness from peeking round his caution. "Say you found me contrite," Holmes returned, tying the string with a small flourish, and, in the same movement, drawing the knot once across the man's left glove, as if confiding it to his keeping. It left the faintest dead-grey kiss upon the kid. "Say that I burned slowly." He held the parcel without offering it. "And whom do I thank for her patience?" The man produced a card from a pocketbook. It bore the bird, impressed, and the words, "Mr. Pierce, Messenger." The ink on the bird smudged to my eye precisely as Greaves's gluey black has always done upon cards that will not dry in a hurry. Holmes's lip crooked, the barest parenthesis. He set the card upon the dish as one sets a name place for a guest one does not intend to seat, and handed over the parcel. The man weighed it. I could see the small recalibration in his hand as he registered sermons where he had expected sin. He slipped it within an inner pocket, shaped by habit, to the form of a book. "Good morning," he said. "Better than your evening will be if you trip upon a horse block," Holmes replied, already, to all appearances, bored with him. "Mind the step." The door closed with the modesty of furniture. In the instant after it, Holmes's face shed its indolence like a glove. He was at the window with the look of a cat who hears between floorboards. "He turns toward Portland Place," he said softly. "Not to the station, not to the Adelphi. He keeps the north side, and now east. He sniffs a magistrate's breath in the breeze, and chooses the house over Bow Street." "You meant him to," I said, already at the bedroom door, with the pistol that coughed. "I meant him to show us which chair our author prefers," Holmes returned. "Come, Lestrade will have a pair a dozen paces behind him, but London eats men whole before noon if one leaves them to the pavements." We were out within a minute. Mrs. Hudson, stumping in with the resolute tread she uses on trifling statesmen and great dust alike, accepted the order. "If a gentleman with too much ink on his glove calls again, he may have tea in the kitchen until I return," with a sniff that asserted she had been bait in better traps. The street had its January face on, veiled, preoccupied, and yet always attending from the tail of its eye. Our man kept that pace clerks use when they have been told to hurry and have decided, for defiance, to do it quietly. Twice he paused to be sure of a turn. Twice a hansom cut the corner so close to him that only a man who had no wish to live would have remained inattentive. He swayed without looking up. Holmes, who has a scientist's cruelty in the laboratory and a hunter's mercy in the field, set our own step so that we were always 2 doors behind the second pair of boots that served Lestrade, and 3 behind the parcel. At Cavendish Square the messenger took a cab. We did not. Holmes's hand brushed my sleeve, and we swung into a hired brougham already dozing at the curb. "Follow that hansom," he said, through the trap with so little drama that the driver, who must have heard the phrase "abused all his life," believed it. The city moved round us like a chessboard rearranging itself without moving a single piece. Our quarry's cab chose the straight for Regent Street, then slid south again by Pall Mall, where a dozen faces could have received a ledger without altering their plans for luncheon. He did not stop at any club door. He went on to a narrow turning by the back of the Treasury, and there descended with the indifference of a man who goes every day to the same bell. The bell belonged to a house whose stone had learned to be important without showing off. 2 windows up, a blind stirred and fell. Holmes laid 2 fingers upon my arm. Vere will not have him wait below if he hopes for comfort, he said. He will take the parcel to his own table and cut the string with the ring that ruins his gloves. Now is when ink pays. We left our brougham a house length off. Lestrade's pair, practised in the art of being furniture, had already taken the lampposts for cousins. Holmes did not go to the bell. He examined the area railings, the fanlight, the sill. His lens appeared and vanished like a heron's beak. He touched the iron of the area gate. It gave, unlatched from within. "Careless or confident," he breathed. And there, do you see it? The smallest kiss of grey upon the iron, as if a man steadied a parcel by his glove as he slid it clear. "You would break in?" I whispered. It is not a thing one whispers to the innocent air of Whitehall and expects an answer to commend one's virtue. "I would knock," he said, and his mouth thinned with that dry amusement of his which makes policemen perspire and villains pray for stupidity in their enemies. "And I would be received." He did, and we were. The door opened upon a butler of the new school, trench-trained at the front line between his master and the world. "Sir Talbot receives only—" "Truth," Holmes interposed, and put his card upon a salver with such inevitability that the metal understood what the man wished to deny. "We will not trouble him with my name twice." We were shown through a cool, high room into a smaller one where a fire burned with the exactitude of expenditure without warmth. Sir Talbot Vere stood at the mantel with his back to it and the parcel, opened upon a low table where a man might rest a book while he altered a country with a speech. He did not start, he did not ring. He looked at Holmes as at a wind he had not ordered, and inclined his head a quarter-inch. "Mr. Holmes," he said. He had the voice the house favours, clear, measured, and incapable of embarrassment. "You have brought me a difficulty." Holmes bowed the least fraction. "I have brought you a mirror," he said. "It is the only article men cannot borrow from their friends." Vere's left hand lay idle against the waistcoat. Upon its glove, at the second joint of the forefinger, the nick showed, and below the nick a smut that had not been there at breakfast. He did not hide it. He turned the hand deliberately and set the ring to catch the light, as if to say, "I know your arithmetic, and am not ashamed of adding." "You have a book, Mr. Holmes," he said, "or you do not. In either case, you propose to make of it a cudgel. I propose to make of it a walking stick. We may both be disappointed." "The book I have," Holmes returned softly, "does not contain sermons. It contains a habit, Sir Talbot, and habits stand in the witness box with greater accuracy than their owners." "Then bring them," said Vere, and smiled with a coolness that, I confess, pricked even my soldier's hide. "Bring your habits to Bow Street and to the house. I shall argue that in a city such as ours, where mud is the people's inheritance, the gentleman who contrives to cross a street without soiling his boots deserves a statue, not a summons." Holmes's head inclined, as if acknowledging an adversary whose blade he admired, while despising the doctrine it served. "You will argue it better," he said. "You will argue that the poor love their chains and that a lady's ruin is an invitation to breakfast. You will smile, and men who have smiled at worse will cheer. I have brought you something that cheers no one." He drew from his pocket, not the ledger, but the porcelain lid we had taken from the dish, with the bead of household wax along its seam, and, upon its underside, the paler, finer smear of clay that did not belong to Riverbank or Belgravia. He set it beside the cut string. "You hide your arithmetic in the mouths of swans," he said. "You lock it with wax stolen from a lady's drawer. You pass it with gloves you mend twice monthly. You drug a man with a cup. You did not have the courage to breathe through yourself, and you send clerks to do the work your ring would dirty. You have chosen your theatre poorly, Sir Talbot. The river loves tragedy. The courts prefer farce. Vere's eyes, which had practiced emptiness until they could pass for depth, darkened by a shade. "You preach," he said. "I state." Holmes returned. "And I offer you the only bargain you will be offered. You will give me a hand, not a name. The hand that turned the key to the Swan last night. The hand that smeared the bell cord twice, not once." He fled the Armitage. He was not the man we took on the embankment. He is dearer to you than Hargreave and more useful than any woman you have paid to be silent. He is, I surmise, an honesty you misused before you purchased his loyalty, your groom, your cousin, your private secretary in boy's clothes. I do not yet know. You will give him to me with a statement signed, or I will give your book to a magistrate whose wife reads the morning editions. Vere's smile did not move, but the space behind it altered. His gaze went past us to the door and back, calculating speed, force, noise, and whether any of those nouns could be disciplined into the verb escape. "You have not the book," he said softly, and for the first time I heard uncertainty enter and lose a place in his sentence. "You would not bring it into my rooms?" Holmes did not blink. "I brought what ink could do to your glove," he said, and in that instant there came in the passage the discreet scuff that means a policeman has placed his weight where the floor knows it and is willing to hold. Vere heard it too. The pause in him was as plain as if a clock had stopped in the room. "You have till noon," Holmes added, taking out his watch as if to consult a friend who rarely lies. "It is 20 minutes to 11. At 11 a parcel will go to St. Catherine's. It will satisfy the man you sent this morning that he has done well. At noon the yard will call, either at Bow Street upon Hargreave for the oath and the apparatus, or here upon you for the arithmetic and the theatre. Choose which audience you prefer." Vere looked at the cut string and at the porcelain lid, and at last at the smudge upon his glove, as if it were a foreign power's envoy who had somehow acquired a vote in his borough. He said nothing. He did not need to. For the first time, the advantage left his hand and stood with us by the fire. Holmes bowed as a man bows to a portrait in a gallery he expects to see hung lower next season, and turned. I followed, feeling the air of the room let us go with the reluctant civility power practices when it knows it is to be called to account. In the street, Holmes drew a breath that was not relief. "He will use the hour to do something stupid as cleverly as he can," he said, "and the river will be offered another secret if we are not at St. Catherine's when the decoy meets its buyer. Come, Watson, Lestrade will close on Vere at noon if I have judged the city's appetite correctly. Until then, we hunt the hand. St. Catherine's keeps a different clock from the West End. It ticks to the swing of cranes and the thud of bales. The river there speaks a broader dialect with foreign syllables in the swell." By the time we reached the basin, the fog had thinned to a lid of pewter, and the docks, half seen, looked like the machined innards of some immense watch. Holmes, with the brim of his hat pulled low and his stick tucked under his arm, as if it were a ledger he had grown tired of balancing, moved through the traffic as a man moves through his own thoughts, quick, exact, and without apology. Our arrangement had been simple. Mrs. Hudson's tin of sermons, wrapped as before, had gone with Lady Theodosia's Abigail in a plain bandbox and a shawl. She was to mount the omnibus at the Marble Arch, descend at Aldgate, and come on here as if to visit a cousin who laundered for sailors. Lestrade's men drew an airy line, not close enough to warm her heels, not far enough to lose her shadow. Our part was to stand where the shadow thickened and take the hand that waited to gather it. "There," Holmes said, and his chin made the smallest movement toward a set of steps between two warerooms where a sloop's boat could lie unseen by all but those who made it their business to look. A man leaned at the head of the steps as if there were virtue in idleness, cap turned down, collar up, attitude of a fellow who lives by not hurrying to anything unless coin is at the other end. His right shoulder was a trifle higher. I felt, absurdly, the same click in my mind that a rifle bolt makes when it seeks the chamber it knows. The girl came on, the bandbox crooked in her arm. She was not an actress. The little stiffness in her step was honesty, not artifice. She paused to ask a question at a stall, bought a penny bun she did not want, and stood to eat it as if she had come only for the bread. The man at the steps did not look at her. He looked at the bun and then away. Another man passed, touched his finger to his cap in a way that any eye but Holmes's would have missed, and dropped a word that could have been whether or whither. The first replied by the smallest lift of the chin. The tide of the place went on without noticing that a new current had joined it. The girl finished the bun, dropped the paper, and, as if deciding herself in a domestic matter, took the steps. Holmes did not speak. He walked beside me and then ceased to be beside me, so exactly did he alter his pace to let the warehouse door hide him for a breath. When he appeared again, he had lost an inch of height and gained 10 years' labour. It is no use describing what he does. The description always comes after the thing and is therefore late. He was behind the man at the head of the steps at the instant the bandbox came level with his hands. "Easy, miss," the man said, and the voice was careful not to own any borough. "Heavy for the likes of you. I'll take that." He did not grasp the handle. He slid 2 fingers under the rim to test for paper and string and something that felt like a book. "Thank you, sir," she managed, and I admired her because the "sir" was not theatre. It was fear doing its duty. "Just there," he added, with a flick toward the boat below. A figure in that boat, only a hat and hands visible, reached up without turning his face. The sleeve that showed was neat, the glove cleaner than the river had any right to touch. Holmes's stick spoke once against the stone. The sound was nothing, a polite tap. Yet I saw the man's head tilt by a fraction, as dogs tilt when a whistle sits beyond men's hearing. The next instant the bandbox swung, but not as the man intended. It swung toward Holmes's left, where his hand, as patient as a parson's and as ruthless, took the weight and drew it to a hip. The man's right shoulder came up, habit, not courage, and met my pistol with the inevitability of an appointment he had not wished to keep. "Shall we finish the errand together?" Holmes said to him as if offering to share a valise. "You will not like the water today. It is inclined to keep what is given it." The figure in the boat started, a little jerk, nothing, and then sat very still, which was sensible of him. A constable, who had been examining a coil of rope as if it held philosophical interest, suddenly discovered himself at the foot of the steps. The hand at the head had a choice between flight and the kind of stillness that merely postpones movement. He chose stillness. The glove on his left hand was of good kid with a dark stain at the base of the forefinger. His cap sat low, but the angle of the jaw was young and cruel in a careful way. "Name," Holmes said, not as a question, but as a courtesy. "Thomas Vere," the young man said promptly, with a defiance that tried to pass for frankness. "And if you do not like it, you can call me Tom." "Cousin?" Holmes asked, as one names a bird in hedgerow. "Brother," he returned, and the pride in the word gave him away as much as the colour on his cheek. "You'll have your story, Mr. Busy, but you'll not have the book." I'll drown it before—" "The sermons?" Holmes inquired, soft as a priest at a deathbed. He flicked the lid with a finger. The act was insolent, and in the same breath a policeman's hand closed on his wrist with a cheerfulness I envied. "You'll mind your manners," the constable said. The figure in the boat breathed out. It could have been laughter or relief or both. Holmes's eyes had already climbed to the hat brim there. "Up," he said, pleasant as a host. "We will make a family scene of it." The boatman obeyed with the resignation of a man who has finally realized that his day's labor will not go to his wife as coin, and a pair of cuffs went on him with the same urbanity the Thames uses when it makes a man cold to teach him to buy better coats. The younger Vere did not struggle. I have seen some men accept arrest the way a gentleman accepts a bill, offended at the figure but determined to pay it with style. He looked past us, toward the wide water, as if it and ambition were the same thing, and both had betrayed him. Lestrade arrived with that science he possesses of being both late and in time. He took one look, one breath, and one step, and in that sequence I saw him add a line to the daybook in his head. Author's hand, Tom Vere. Buyer's boat, paid man. Noon, Sir Talbot. He nodded to Holmes with the fellowship of men who have, for the moment, signed the same order. "You will come to Bow Street," he told the young man. "You may write your reform from there." Thomas Vere smiled with his brother's cold ease. "I will write it on the river," he said. "It reads better there." "We will show you paper," Lestrade returned, and with that admirable economy which is the envy of surgeons and policemen, he turned the scene into travel. Holmes did not look at the bandbox again. He had left it with the girl and thanked her with a word that would buy her courage a month's sleep. His attention had already passed, like a lantern's beam, to Noon. "He will offer up Tom," he said to me, as we stood aside to let the yard do its tidy work. "Not from conscience, from mathematics, but he will do it in a way that preserves a speech. We must choose the place for him." We took another hansom. London, in that mid-morning, had contrived to look innocent. There is no hour more dangerous in the city than the one which convinces a guilty man that he has time. At the Treasury turning we descended again and walked. Holmes sent a boy with a penciled message that would reach Bow Street like a whisper and rouse it better than any shout. Then he did a thing that always moves me more than his disguises. He arranged himself to be ordinary. He stood at a window with his back to the street, adjusted his glove, consulted his watch. These domestic acts which make a man part of the furniture he intends to overthrow. At noon precisely a brougham drew up at Vere's door with that absence of announcement which is the loudest way to arrive. Sir Talbot came out himself. He had chosen a coat that made him look like a portrait, and a hat that made him a statement. Beside him, with his wrists tastefully hidden in a muff, walked Tom Vere, pale and pleased, like a guest about to be toasted. There was a paper in Sir Talbot's hand. I would have wagered my medical degree it was a statement written in a style meant to look like a confession and to read like a sermon. Lestrade did not trouble him with the indignity of being taken at the step. He let the brougham roll to the corner where Whitehall's decent stones meet the law's more practical ones. There the inspector was waiting in a doorway as if considering luncheon. He came out as a man comes for air, and found himself with a baronet in his hand. "Sir Talbot," he said, and his tone was that of a man who regrets the necessity and enjoys the success. "You will accompany me. Your brother will do the same. Mr. Holmes—" He had the grace to include my friend as if the city itself had decided.
"To make him official, has suggested that you may prefer to spare the House the piquant novelty of hearing charges in the lobby." Vere raised his head a fraction. The statement in his hand did not tremble. He looked at Holmes, and the look had iron filings in it. "You have chosen your theatre,"
he said. I have chosen your audience, Holmes replied. The courts forgive less than the benches. For a breath I thought Sir Talbot would attempt the folly pride dictates and common sense refuses. Then the habit of power returned. It hundreds a man's movements into gestures that look like justice to those who prefer to be told what justice is. He handed Lestrade the paper. For your magistrate, he said. I have not the honour to trust your newspapers. We shall see they trust you, Lestrade returned. He spoke low to his men. The small machine of the law began to move. Tom Vere glanced once at the river's direction, as if he could see it through stone, and laughed without a sound. Holmes watched them go with that grave detachment, which is not indifference, but the only decency one may offer a man who has chosen his fall. He turned then, and for the first time since the river launch under Vauxhall Bridge, I saw fatigue draw a fine line along his cheek. Come, Watson, he said. There is one more visit. I promised a lady I would tell her before I told London. At Vale House, Lady Theodosia received us as a commander receives a dispatch, without flinching, and with the air of one who will decide what the dispatch means to her soldiers before the enemy can. Holmes told the tale without embroidery. The docks, the bandbox, the brothers, the noon arrest. He did not show her the ledger. He told her what he had taken from it, the men whose names would go to the yard, and those whose husbands' names would not, if he could stand between them and a headline. You are very hard, she said softly when he had done, and very kind. I am not certain which part of you London deserves. Neither, he said, but it shall have the arithmetic. If I have spared your oaths, it is because I dislike a sermon that uses the wrong text. He took from his pocket the small swan pin with the missing eye, and set it upon the table beside her hand. If you will take advice from a bachelor, he added, with a half-smile that accepted its own impertinence, you will choose a different emblem when you do good in secret. Birds invite poems, accounts prefer iron. She looked at the pin as if it were a child who had been found engaging in a mischief that was both clever and indefensible. It shall go in a drawer, she said, and the drawer shall be locked. Throw away the key, Holmes murmured. Keys have a way of making men honest at the wrong hour. When we came out again into the grey, I felt the case, for all its theatre, had lowered its curtain. The city resumed its breath. The river, appeased, took up its sober work of carrying other men's secrets toward the sea. Holmes, who has never loved applause and cannot abide encores, turned his face instinctively toward Baker Street. As we rode, he tapped his fingers once upon his knee, not in impatience, but in that rhythm he uses when a melody has resolved itself at last. You will write it as you like, he said to me without looking round. Only omit the sermons. And the swans? You may keep one feather, he allowed, smiling a fraction. It will satisfy your readers that we were poetic while ensuring that they do not attempt this sort of philanthropy at home. I laughed then, and the laugh, like the fog lifting from the river, did us both the good that laughter can. The evening that followed was one of those rare London nights when the fog holds its breath and the city seems to pause between heartbeat and silence. The case of the shadow of the midnight swan, if indeed it had ever been a case and not a series of moral reckonings disguised as one, had reached its natural close. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, that small eternal island of warmth and intellect, amid the cold expanse of the city, where the kettle already murmured in welcome. Holmes threw his coat upon the armchair, the gesture neither careless nor deliberate, and drew the black ledger from its hiding-place within the tin. He placed it upon the table with the quiet reverence that only he affords to evidence. For a long moment he looked at it as one might regard a beast that has been tamed but not entirely broken. "It is finished, then?" I asked, seating myself opposite him. The weariness of the chase had caught me, but the satisfaction of truth discovered gave me strength enough to want his summation. Holmes shook his head. "Finished? My dear Watson, nothing is ever finished in London. We have merely placed one Swan back into the water and convinced it to float the right way up." He opened the ledger to its first page, turning the entries as a priest might turn the leaves of a misused Bible. "Look here," he said. "You see the pattern? Every figure follows another as shadows follow men. One begins in charity and ends in convenience. Alistair Vale, for all his faults, tried to steer this tide into decency, but he lacked the ruthlessness required to stand against those who profited from it. When he spoke of ending the game, Sir Talbot Vere saw only danger, a gentleman's panic to a man who had turned corruption into creed." "And his brother?" I said, recalling the pale, handsome arrogance of the young man at the docks. "Thomas Vere, the hand that carried out the deed?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, though perhaps more a dagger than a hand. Tom Vere was a useful blade, driven by admiration and bloodline. His brother spoke of ideals and reform. Tom heard only conquest and played at it with other men's lives. It was he who smeared the bell cord, set the clock, and arranged the final performance aboard the midnight Swan. His brother supplied the mind, but Tom, the youth, the vanity, provided the hand. When Hargreave discovered what had been done, Vere arranged for him to be silenced by the very machinery he had built, a club of silence operating under the pretense of moral discretion." He paused, then smiled faintly, a rare gentleness warming his eyes. "But Lady Theodosia, in her quiet courage, has undone more wickedness by her stillness than any man with a sermon could. By preserving the dignity of those innocents her husband sought to protect, she has, in her own way, restored what justice may exist for those too poor to purchase it." "She will recover?" I asked softly. "Perhaps not recover," he said, "but endure. Endurance is the truer virtue in this world, Watson. Redemption is merely its shadow." He closed the book, and for an instant I saw the shadow of the black feather upon the table, the echo of the case that had begun with a single death and ended with a city cleansed by exposure, though still far from clean. Lestrade had called earlier in the evening, leaving a brief note. Vere confessed. Hargreave aiding prosecution. River secure, Scotland Yard indebted. Holmes had read it and said nothing. Now, with the ledger safely locked in his drawer, he took up his violin and turned toward the fire, the lamplight tracing the fine edges of his profile. "Watson," he said after a time, "have you ever considered how truth resembles that river outside our window?" "In what way?" "In that it carries everything, mud and moonlight alike, and men, fools that we are, imagine we can choose which will reach the sea. But the current has no favourites. It bears guilt as easily as innocence. All we can do is make certain that what we put upon it floats, not sinks." He raised the violin to his shoulder, drew the bow once across the strings, and the first note rose, low, deep, a minor key that sounded almost like the river's own voice. The melody grew, thoughtful and slow, as if London herself were being lulled into confession. The last vibrations faded into the room's quiet, and Holmes laid the instrument aside. "Will you publish it, Watson?" he asked, not looking at me. "The case, I mean?" "Yes," I said, "but not all. I will keep her name hidden, and I will soften the worst of it."
The public admires virtue, Holmes, but it needs its illusions intact. He smiled faintly. Then you have learned the one truth I never could, that humanity prefers its truths wrapped in paper and tied with ribbon. Very well, Doctor, wrap this one in fog, as London does all its sins. He stood, drew the curtains, and looked out at the street where the lamps swam dimly through the mist. The midnight Swan lies moored again, he said. Her decks washed, her name no longer a jest. The river keeps her secrets, but not forever. It is a patient confessor. He turned back to the fire, and for a brief moment his expression softened. Less the keen detective, more the philosopher who has seen too much of men's motives and not enough of their mercy. The world, my dear Watson, he said at last, is a place of endless masks. What we call evil often hides behind principle. What we call virtue often conceals appetite. But somewhere between the two there stands truth. Quiet, unadorned, and curiously unrespected. It is my singular misfortune to chase it. And my fortune, I said, to follow you in the pursuit. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that might have meant gratitude or simply agreement with the order of things. Then may you always have a steady pen and a steadier heart, he murmured. The clock on the mantel struck midnight, the true midnight this time, without deception or delay. Holmes extinguished the lamp, and the room surrendered to shadow, save for the thin gleam of the firelight upon the violin's curve. Outside, the river moved on, unhurried and inscrutable, carrying the last whisper of the midnight Swan toward the sea.